Today we'll go through the classical King's Indian in 10 minutes, and that is the position we have here on the board, with black playing King's Indian setup and white playing the classical variation, the main line with knight f3, bishop e2. Of course, it can arise from a lot of different move orders, but the most common one would be with a Queen's Gambit style approach with white, black just playing pure King's Indian, and then after d6 is going knight f3 and bishop e2. And of course, this could arise from a lot of different move orders, say with white playing knight f3 on move 2, move 1, or even an English move order. So it's a very relevant position for a lot of people in their repertoires. And I will be covering it for both sides so you can feel comfortable playing positions either way and knowing kind of what your options are. As usual, I'm going to start kind of with the main line and then sort of work our way back towards some of the sidelines from there. So basically, knight c6 is known as kind of the Mar del Plata variation, provoking this move of d5 with a tempo, so that black will be able to go for the kingside pawn storm and try to mate our king. And it was in the 1990s that Vladimir Kramnik really showed the strength of this bayonet variation with b4, just trying to get the attack on the black pawn chain as quickly as possible. And after knight h5, something that should be mentioned about the King's Indian, just being upfront as someone who played this opening most of my junior career, is that you don't get full equality playing as black. If white finds the best moves from here, which incidentally is to go c5 and go for this a4 approach, then yeah, white does get a small advantage with best play. The thing with the King's Indian is you always get chances. You always get an interesting position with good fighting chances to play for a win. Meaning that as white, we should also take it very seriously because our opponent's really going to try to put pressure on us in different ways. You can kind of see how the knight f4, we can kind of just play around it and not really fear the exchange. Because in the past, people were kind of playing it with the move g3 and just trying to avoid knight f4 altogether. That does weaken the king a little bit, and also rook e1. This was a system I played quite a lot with the black pieces as a junior, but then in Modern Engines kind of showed that the move knight f4 probably gives black quite good chance of equality, and so the theory kind of moved on a little bit since I was a kid, let's say. But if you're enjoying this video so far, do make sure to leave a like button and hit that like button. And also, you can subscribe to the channel as well, especially if you're a bit newer here. You'll decide to access some more videos like these on here. But yeah, let's sort of conclude the bayonet coverage just by saying at a5. It is a bit more strategic alternative. White can take on a5, or they can play bishop a3, which is a bit more common. But it's going to kind of come to the same battleground where white is going to be trying to open the queen side, and black is going to try and make some measures against that. White's a little bit better, but it's a good fighting position where the better player will win. There are also a couple of other options as well that white can go for. Like if you want a full repertoire as black, you do need something against moves like knight e1 and knight d2 as well. But the theory has kind of been worked out here, where it's sort of been established that whether white tucks the bishop away on f2 to defend the king, or leaves on d2, black's man's going to be the same, like g5, knight g6, knight f6, g4. Sometimes you can also bring the rook around to prepare it this way. And that's just going to give you just a very decent attacking chances, where objectively you're doing fine as well. And knight d2 is sort of like a poor man's version of bayonet, because a5 just really slows up the queenside play, and black is just basically fine there. Just to kind of conclude the knight c6 coverage before moving on to some of black's alternatives to this move. The move bishop b3 is also possible here, but it does give black some good options and isn't really theoretically critical. I will admit that this sort of delayed exchange with takes on bishop g5 is something that has annoyed me a little bit in the past as black. So if you're looking for a lazy system against the Mar del Plata, this can be a way to do it. But again, black should be fine if they know what they're doing here. I think h6 is meant to be the equalizer from memory. With that though, let's also touch on some of the alternatives so that you're covered with both sides. Because I know not everyone likes to play those closed knight c6 positions. I know that was probably the weakest part of my repertoire my whole lifetime. So if you want something different, these next lines might appeal to you more. So after e takes d4, this is an approach I was actually playing quite a bit in the early 2010s, where I played it with both c6 and with knight c6 as kind of two different ways of playing it. Basically, the idea of c6 was kind of revived a little bit by Magnus Carlsen, where he played this game against Ding Liren after king h1 and d5, where he just kind of blew open the center. That's kind of the whole idea of playing c6, to just open the center and have your bishop and pieces come to life. It used to be thought to be a bad line because of bishop g5, but then this sort of exchange sacrifice of h6 kind of shown to be actually quite quite playable for black. So it's something you may like to explore in your own time if you're so inclined, but I should mention a move like knight c2 is a prophylactic move to avoid d5 that should give white a little bit of an edge. So it's not a perfect solution, but again, there's no perfect solution in King's Indian. For those of you who are just happy like to make a solid draw, or just play very safely in general, there is this approach of knight h5 and knight f4, which you just kind of liquidate the pieces and just sort of say, you're slightly worse, but you're probably not going to lose if you play quite carefully. And there are move orders where I can play like knight c6 to try to avoid that and keep against a little bit of an edge with the extra space. And moves like f5 just don't necessarily have the desired effect. You just have to play a little bit patiently in these cases. But let's also look at some of the alternatives. Basically in the really old days of the King's Indian, the move knight bd7 was actually one of the main lines. These days you don't see it as much, but it is still a legitimate system, and say if you want to play like an old Indian move order, then you would be sort of committed to knight d7 there anyway. And here, the old main line is going with c6 and kind of playing these more close positions, but modern ninjas nowadays just think these structures is really bad for black, and a big reason why is that this g4 plan just makes it really hard for black to get any sort of pawn break, because if they go f5, you kind of get a really nice e4 outpost for the pieces, you get a g-file to attack their king, so it just ends up being really rough for black. And that's kind of why you'll tend to see, if they're in play rook e8, they might play a move like queen e7 and go for plans like this, which have been a bit more trendy in recent years as a way to try to get a game. Of course, black can also play moves like rook e1 and bishop f1 and just play like really prophylactically for a small edge, just keeping things really safe and not sort of giving a target in the bishop. The move like knight h6 is kind of a more modern version of knight bd7, where sort of keeping that diagonal open for the bishop and saying you have a bit more activity. The way they used to play it back when I was sort of a junior was going knight g4 and queen to e8. But nowadays it's kind of thought that even if you just take and just play very simply, the white's just going to have a small edge because their knight's going to be a little bit offside, like whether they go for knight h6 or whether they go back to f6, you just kind of have this bit extra space where their pieces just look a little bit misplaced. Like you can go for c5, bring the knight around here, and it's, just a little bit annoying for black. Which is one reason why black has tried some other things, but if you go f6, often the knight just ends up being really misplaced on h6, and okay, bishop queen 7 has been quite popular among some modern King's Indian experts, but again, it's beyond scope of the video to go too deep into it. One line that's been quite trendy in recent years, and basically because it's the favourite line in the engine at very high depth, is the move of h6, which is kind of a little bit of a waiting move, where you're sort of looking to play very solidly. Like, there are a lot of games between Carlsen and Firouzja, where they were just kind of playing this approach, where Carlsen was building up very steadily, and Firouzja tried some games with a5, also played a queenside fianchetto, which normally is not a good idea in a King's Inn, because then your bishop gets shut after d5. But it's probably one of the very few versions where you can kind of make it work. It's true to h6 white should still be a little bit better, but it's a way just to get a more strategic position. And there also can be a bit of surprise value in a few traps for white, like bishop e3, knight g4. It's a little annoying because you don't have bishop g5 anymore. And if you go h3 to repair bishop e3, then you sort of have a bit of a dilemma where f3 isn't so good anymore when you weaken these squares around the king's side. But bishop f3 is also kind of very awkward and also gives black quite good play with quite natural moves. Other options tend to just not really have the desired effect. Like if you go c6 as a sort of long line, which, okay, we can't fully do justice to, but the point is that this endgame is just a very thankless one for black, where they will probably lose the bishop pair in the next moves. And the bishop g4 pin just tends not to be that effective. Like d5 just leaves your bishop misplaced, because you kind of need that bishop for the mating attack. If they go like f3, h3, you want to be able to sack the bishop or use the bishop repair to g4 break. Otherwise, you just don't have any counterplay. And just to kind of quickly conclude, I sort of haven't really left enough time, but basically d5, the Petrosian variation, is also an option for white, but it just turns out that if you kind of play healthy moves and make sure you kind of get your bishop into the game with bishop h6, it turns out that black is basically doing fine in this position. The Gligorich is also kind of popular, but again, you kind of can go ed4 and sort of get an improved version of those c6, d5 lines because of the bishop being a bit stuck. And if they do play the exchange variation, you kind of can choose, whether you either go for the main line of rook e8 and just play very solidly with cd5, or whether you decide to make it a bit more ambitious and just go for some active play with b5 and try and get a bit more imbalance in the position. Finally, if they don't play e5, most of them is going to transpose something else like knight d7. Transposes, knight 6 transpose to what we looked at. If they go c5, it can end up transposing into a Maroczy bind, and actually a version is very, very promising for whites. And if they do pin our knight, it's just really not that scary. Like a simple response even can be to just go knight g1 and you just kind of get an improved same-ish where, you haven't got the bad light squared bishop and just have a very solid center. But yeah, that's all for the classical Kings Indian 10 minutes. I hope that you enjoyed this video and found it valuable. Do let me know in comments below what was your favorite variation out of the ones that I showed you here. And I will see you in the next one. Good luck with this opening and take care.